to Chris Doyle, who is a Middle East commentator and director of the Council of Arab-British Understanding. He joins us live. Chris, as far as you're concerned, is this the end of the ceasefire?
It's too early to tell, but certainly the Israeli government and Prime Minister Netanyahu give every indication of itching, literally, to bomb Gaza to try to upend this. The whole time they are testing the Trump administration's desire and willingness to try to keep all of this alive, because this has not really been as a result of some major violations of the ceasefire, even the accusations that all sides are making. But what you see is just how precarious it is, that there are elements, arguably on all sides, who are really prepared to risk chucking Gaza back into full-scale Israeli military operations to get that genocide resumed at full pace. So the question now is, as you've just been discussing, just what the Trump administration will do. And it's extraordinary, isn't it, that the world's superpower has to dispatch its leading principals, Vice President, Secretary of State, the son-in-law of the president the whole time. Next, I think, is the head of the CIA, just to keep Israel in check. It is not even enough to have a phone call from the president to tell Netanyahu that he's got to stop being so aggressive. So I think everything is very much on the line. But Trump is also guilty of having exaggerated and hyped up what he has achieved. And instead of saying that this is a ceasefire, which it was, arguably that no longer exists, he tried to proclaim that this was eternal peace, the end of a 3,000-year-old conflict, which was clearly nonsense. But the trouble is, he now has to live up to that sort of rhetoric. He has claimed that this is the end of all of this, is a brave new dawn that's going to cover the Middle East, and he wants to keep that alive. If he's going to do that, though, he's really got to read the riot act to Prime Minister Netanyahu, but also his colleagues in his coalition government.
Chris, we're just rolling live pictures from the Israel-Gaza border. It looks like we're seeing flashes in the sky yet. We're not able to tell you exactly where in Gaza that is. It is very difficult to establish facts on the ground. As we know, the communications systems there, like much of Gaza, not only destroyed, but totally and utterly leveled. That, of course, has fed into a lot of these difficulties that we've been discussing around finding the remains of the hostages and returning them. Chris, you talked a little bit about the sort of meta diplomacy. I just wonder what your perspective is on what the domestic considerations of this are. We heard our correspondent in occupied East Jerusalem, Mohammed Al-Qasem, there talking about how the considerations of the Israeli public, Israeli voters, have really changed since the start of this ceasefire deal because the living hostages have been returned. Can you give us your assessment of what the sort of political calculations, what the larger calculations are likely to be really of Benjamin Netanyahu and many of his extreme right members of his government, Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir and others, and what they think their ultimate goal in this? We know that they talk about the destruction of Hamas, but they must have amongst the intelligence that they claim to be in possession of, a fundamental understanding that at this point Hamas may not be utterly destroyable.
Well, I think all of these actors have slightly different agendas. The agenda of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the agendas of those two extremely right-wing ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, are not necessarily the same. They don't have the same interest. Netanyahu wants to stay in power. He wants to remain as prime minister. It may be that he has to eventually ditch those two to do that. He wants to make sure that he doesn't go to court. And he has more of an interest in keeping things sweet with the American administration. That's not something that seems to worry the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Their agenda is very different. They want to be heard. They want their agenda in terms particularly of the West Bank, in terms of getting annexation, the expansion of those massive settlements going forward. Their agenda is very different. They don't believe that they're going to become an Israeli prime minister, so they can be a very tough actor. They know that they hold the whip hand because they can bring down this coalition government. But you're absolutely right to point to the hostages, because the only thing now that is holding back this Netanyahu coalition is no longer the hostages. They've been released, the live ones. And therefore, it is only the Trump administration. If you take the Trump administration out of this equation, then I think that this coalition would go back to a full-scale onslaught in Gaza. They would not have any pressure to keep to that ceasefire at all. And then you can debate as to what the agendas might be. For some, it'll be annexation of some or all of Gaza, the expulsion of much of the population. It could just be the complete and utter destruction of Hamas if they really think that they can achieve that. Of course, that's extremely improbable. Hamas is continuing. There are young people who join it for all sorts of reasons. It may have been degraded massively. It is much weaker than it was 2 years ago, but it still is a force. And we've seen that actually since the breaking out of the ceasefire.
Chris, in your estimation, I wonder why it has been so difficult for other countries to have an influence on Israel, apart from the United States. We know that countries including Turkey, including Qatar, including Egypt, have been key players in figuring out how to get to this ceasefire position in the first place. But otherwise, Israel has seemed basically to be quite willing to turn a deaf ear to them.
The United States is the primary backer. It is the state that supplies nearly all the weaponry, the financial backing, the diplomatic backing. But where you do see the relevance of these other states, including Turkey and Qatar and Egypt, is the influence on the Trump administration. And I think that is one of the things that has changed, in that ideally Israel doesn't want these regional actors involved at all, other than to engage in some normalization process with Israel. They want to keep this really to be an issue between Israel and the United States. But Trump has forced them to engage in this. This means that there is going to be an international stabilization force, that there is going to be a situation where United Nations agencies are operational in Gaza, things that in an ideal world this Israeli coalition wouldn't have wanted. So all of these countries who may yet fund the reconstruction of Gaza, who may contribute to such a force, now actually have more leverage via the Trump administration than ever before. And that is something that actually won't be really liked in the corridors of power in Israel.
Chris, just one more question to you before we let you go, and as we continue to roll on these live pictures of the Israel-Gaza border. It is vital, of course, that we focus on what is happening in Gaza, that we remind ourselves that even during this ceasefire, at least 94 Palestinians have lost their lives. But were we to see an end of this ceasefire, as we seem to be at the moment, and we are waiting to confirm further details of these strikes, what is likely to be the international reaction to this? We already know just how many people over the last 2 years have repeatedly and publicly protested against the Israelis' actions in Gaza. If we see an end to the ceasefire, as we believe we are, could we again see people coming out onto the streets in the sort of numbers that we had?
I think at a public level, I think you'll see protest demonstrations across the world. I don't think that's going to end. In terms of state actors, I think it will depend on who they blame for having basically ditched the ceasefire, for having broken the ceasefire. And already you're seeing all sides trying to control the narrative as to what has happened here. But regardless of that, I think the primacy should be to get back to this and to revisit, the 20-point plan, such as it is, because it needs a complete revamping to give greater Palestinian agency. But international actors have to be clear that Israel is the occupying power. It does have to let aid in. It didn't. It is the party with by far the greatest amount of force and wherewithal to control the destiny of the Gaza Strip. And it certainly has not acted in good faith.
Chris, thank you so much. Chris Doyle joining us there. Chris is the Middle East commentator and director of the Council of Arab British Understanding. Chris.